First of all, thanks for the wine, guys. I usually have to take a beta block of my anxiety, but this works a little bit more. It doesn't trigger my asthma, so. So I've been led to do this talk today in reaction to a fear, and we've heard this fear a little bit today. It's the fear of biological psychiatry. So some people don't like talking about brain scans and neural correlates because when we reduce a person down to different anatomical brain regions and different neurotransmitters inside the head, we don't find a single self sitting in there. So without a single self, it seems there's no inner person with likes and loves and traumas and setbacks that we could direct psychotherapy towards. So in light of this, it might seem we're left with drugs to treat psychiatric illness, but if one wants to hold on to psychotherapy, there might be this temptation to grasp onto a more magical view of the mind for it to maintain its relevance. So we've all heard of the distinction between psychotherapy for psychological disorders and medications for biological disorders. It's otherwise known as the distinction between brainless psychiatry and mindless psychiatry. But I think this is a false dichotomy. So those that think that a purely biological view of psychiatry undermines the self, I think are in fact right. So I think it is an illusion. But what they may be wrong about is that it wouldn't undermine psychotherapy. So I think that it could empower the idea and it could give us provide us with a direction in the future. So psychotherapy is essentially treatment of the self, so I think that it makes sense that we discern what the self actually is if we hope to make progress. Now, I don't claim to be an authority in this field. I have only just started my formal training in psychotherapy, but this will just be a working synthesis of my attempts to grapple with these problems. So the first thing we have to ask is what is meant by the self? And there are a few different definitions, but the one I'll be working with was given by William James, and it can be conceptualized by considering what it's like when someone asks, "Who are you?" So firstly, you would hear the words coming out of their mouth, you'd see their lips moving, and you'd have the immediate experience being asked a question. And this would be the moment-to-moment experience of the self, and this is sometimes known as the I. And then in response to this question, you then think back on your life. You think about your name, your occupation, where you live, where you grew up, and this would be the narrative formation of the self, and it's sometimes known as the me. So what I'm saying is the self could be conceptualized as the I and the me. So this self feels like a permanent and self-defining entity. So it's a thinker separate from the thoughts and experiencer separate from the experience. So it's one single entity with a past that stretches back through time and will continue to extend onto the future. So we all feel we're propped up inside the head behind the eyes, and that we pervade the constant fluctuations of our mental lives. So I feel I'm the same person as I was yesterday, last month, last year, but there's some underlying principle that must connect these different points in time and unify me. But the self isn't what it seems. I think it's an illusion. Now, it may seem like the existence of oneself is an odd thing to question, almost like asking if we're real or not. But by illusion doesn't mean that the experience of the self doesn't exist, but rather it occurs in a way that's different to our common ideas. So by analogy, if a magician miraculously picks a card from a completely shuffled deck, they can create the illusion of magic. Right? So notice by saying illusion doesn't mean that they didn't pick a card, but rather it happened in a way that was different to your perception. So I'm saying that the self the experience of the self happens in the same way. So it's undoubtedly there, we all feel it, but like the magician, our nervous systems are staging an elaborate trick. So firstly, the concept of the self doesn't make any neuroanatomical sense, as there's no single point in the brain where it could be found. So the brain has many different jobs allocated to different regions. They're spread out over the entire brain, and they involve completely separate neural pathways, and they commonly act in opposition to one another. So there's no single point that receives all the inputs from these processes, and there's no single point from which all these outputs originate from. So as the philosopher Daniel Dennett would say, there's no Cartesian theatre playing for a little self or a little homunculus inside the head. Right? And if you're still convinced there might be a homunculus in the head, then it only begs the question, where's the self inside the homunculus's head? So this thought quickly reveals an infinite regress. You'd have to explain the subjectivity of the subject and so on and so on. Now, not only is there no single self that could be found inside the head, the parts that construct this holistic illusion are constantly changing also. So this has been classically observed in some individuals that suffer from specific types of brain injury, and so they have profound changes in their personality, or they'll lose certain memories, or they might have the inability to recognize their loved ones. But we don't need severe brain injury to experience a change in the self. So the brain isn't the static organ that we once thought it was. There's this well-known process known as neuroplasticity, it's well studied now, which shows us that the wiring of the brain is constantly changing in response to experience. So it can be understood simply by the saying that neurons that fire together wire together. So everything we learn, experience, causes new connections to form, and when we stop doing something, those connections melt away. So every aspect of our mental lives changes in very specific ways when it's altered by tumours, strokes, drugs, trauma, or even just simple aging or experience and learning. So what is it to say that we're a single self when the parts that construct that self are in constant flux? So what is the self then? Well, it's a simulation of the brain, or the nervous system, I should say. So absolutely everything we experience is generated by our nervous system, for where else could these experiences come from? And the movie The Matrix popularized this idea in one sense when Morpheus said to Neo, "What is real? How do you define real?" If real is simply what you can smell, taste, see, and hear, then real is simply electrical signals interpreted by your brain. And he's right in one sense, but what he didn't realize is that this also extends to the self. So our brains are model manufacturing machines, and this model also includes emotions, values, beliefs, and memories. Now, to have a self is a very beneficial property to have. It allows us to survive and thrive in a world that's chaotic and confusing and hostile. But to create a self, it has to be cohesive. Our nervous systems do so with little bits of information. So bits of data from a vast array of sources are stitched together, details are changed, and gaps are filled in to produce a cohesive view of ourselves and the world around us. And the visual system in particular provides us with a good concrete example of this, but our experience of self happens in much the same way. So when we look out at the world, we feel we're receiving a wide range, high definition view of the world. But it's famously known now that that's just not the case. So our high acuity vision encompasses about the tiny size of a 20-cent piece held at arm's length. Everything outside this is a blur, and much of this blur is colourless. Now, furthermore, we have blind spots in our vision. They're actually bigger than our high acuity vision. Our visual system is scrapping together bits of information from here and there. These portions are glued together and they're processed heavily. So some parts are emphasized, others are de-emphasized, false colors are added, contrast is enhanced, and a multitude of assumptions are made, and we have this continuous seamless visual experience. So optical illusions occur precisely because they isolate one of the multitude of assumptions being made by your visual system at every moment, and it magnifies it. So when we look at this picture here, of course we all see a white square, but of course there isn't one. It's merely implied by these four three-quarter circles, and we are taken in by this assumption and we fill in the rest. So when we actually look at this and we look at the gaps between these circles, our edge-detecting neurons are actually firing. So we are experiencing a square that isn't there. So our brains are pattern-searching machines. So they decide on matches and they fill in gaps where needed. And we can imagine the self as a square. So it's an illusion created by the surrounding elements. But if we take the context away, the square or the self disappears. Right? So the visual system provides us with a good concrete example of this, but the self occurs in much the same way. So one of the contextual elements that creates the self are our memories. The memories seem to be fundamental to the self, but they're not recorded and played back like a video. So every time we recall a memory, it has to be actively reconstructed, and so they're highly fallible. And furthermore, there's little correlation between our certainty of certain memories and their actual accuracy of them. But memories aren't just randomly bad, they're tailored with specific assumptions, biases, and fillers so that they fit in with the self that's being constructed. And this is just one example that shows this. Psychologist Wade and his colleagues conducted an experiment where they secretly photoshopped childhood photos of their subjects into a hot air balloon And then over a couple of sessions, I asked these people to recall their hot air balloon trip. And so 50% of people came to have detailed memories about a hot air balloon trip that never actually happened. So these people were induced to accept a new narrative of the self, and so details spawned and shifted to fit in with this self. Some other contextual elements that create the self are, of course, our beliefs and intentions. But like memories, our beliefs and intentions aren't etched in stone, and they're constantly shifting and morphing to fit in with the self that's being constructed. Now, when there's a conflict between our beliefs and intentions and actions in the world, it creates the self to unravel, and this causes mental discomfort that's known as cognitive dissonance. And to avoid this dissonance, we'll unconsciously reinterpret events so that the self can be maintained. All right, so you may have heard of this story. It's one of Aesop's fables, where a hungry fox comes across a bunch of grapes that hung high on a vine. And despite his best efforts, he couldn't reach them. And so he's left by saying, well, I didn't want the grapes because they were sour. So here the fox's inability to attain the goal clashed with his sense of self of being cunning and smart. This causes dissonance here, and so he unconsciously reinterpreted events so that the self could be maintained. Instead of cognitive dissonance, we're usually in search of cognitive ease. So put simply, we like and believe things that are easy to think about. So this has endowed us with a bag of cognitive biases, like attentional bias and confirmational bias. So we are seeking out things in the world that fit in with our sense of self, but when things clash, it causes dissonance, and so we unconsciously change these details so that it all fits in. And another element that maintains a cohesive self is just our moment-to-moment experiences. So top-down processes are cortical functions that are constantly shaping our perception by making guesses based on expectations about what's coming next. So this would have afforded a huge evolutionary advantage for our ancestors because it allowed us to deal with incoming information quickly, make sense of our surroundings quickly, and then we can move on in our quest to survive and reproduce. So when you walked in here today, your past experience of lecture rooms and your expectation to find chairs and a computer and a projector screen meant that you didn't have to pay attention to every detail of every object in this room to make sense of it. So our top-down processes are dependent on our past experiences, our memories, and our beliefs. So they're dependent on the self, and then in turn, this top-down processes will reinforce the self. So this is a picture from the surface of Mars. It's a funny-shaped rock. But if you are a self that believes in conspiracy theories and Martians, your top-down processes will send this expectational bias downwards, and it will alter your perception of this, and so you see a Martian. So perception is constantly a blend of what we're sensing now and what we're expecting. So whether in the present moment or over time, experiences are fragmented episodes unless we weave them into some cohesive narrative. And so the self provides or simply is the center of this narrative. So you wouldn't be able to survive if you had to question yourself and the surroundings constantly. If you came across every experience like it was a baby's first steps, you just wouldn't be able to leave the house in the morning. So even though the self is full of these biases, assumptions, and made-up stories, it provides a great purpose. But that is if the self is a positive one. What happens if the self is a poor construct? So as I said at the start, psychotherapy is essentially treatment of the self, or a defunct self. So it makes sense that we discern what the self is rather than be fooled by our intuitions. Firstly, we should note a few things about psychotherapy. Firstly, it works generally. Secondly, although there's hundreds of different types of psychotherapy, most structured and validated forms of psychotherapy are roughly equivalent in effectiveness. They work for a wide range of psychiatric disorders. And lastly, the benefits of psychotherapy tend to persist or can even accumulate after the cessation of psychotherapy. But how this is actually achieved, no one really knows. So there's no agreed mechanism. And the most predictive factor in the effectiveness is simply the quality of the relationship between the therapist and the patient. So how could this be? Now, I think that it could be best conceptualized as altering the illusion that gives rise to the self. And once we understand what constructs this illusion, we can tinker it to alter the self that's being constructed. So consider someone suffering from depression. We've come to learn now that these people have a distorted perception of the world. It's known as Beck's cognitive triad. So I am worthless, the future is hopeless, and the world is unfair. So these people will have, through memory alteration, cognitive dissonance, cognitive biases, and top-down processes, these people will be forming a world around them that fits in with this constructed self. And when things clash with this, they'll be unconsciously changing details so that it all fits in. Sorry, guys. Now, the most prevalent view of psychological health at the moment is of the person who's willing to go deeply into his or her own problems. So hidden with this view is that if one could know their self completely, if they could expose it by digging down to it, then they would be able to find their help. But as we've seen, there's no immaculate self to dig down to discover or fix. So self is an illusion that's constantly being constructed, and in each moment it's constantly changing. And we can take advantage of this fact. So if we know how the self's constructed, we can override and hijack these mechanisms that give rise to the self and alter it in our favour. So one of the mechanisms that we can hijack is cognitive dissonance. So as I said before, if one acts in a way that disagrees with certain views, we can put pressure on those views to change. So if you encourage a patient to act in a way that disagrees with their views of the self, you can put pressure on the views of the self to change. And then once you change that new self, then the brain will have a reinforcing or snowballing effect where it starts to protect and reinforce this new self. But it's not as simple as just telling a patient act in a certain way and their views of themselves will change. So cognitive dissonance studies have looked at the difference between low coercion and high coercion groups. So if someone is forced to do something through reward or punishment, or the therapist told me so, someone can explain away their inconsistent behaviour and they can maintain their original self. So this might be one reason why therapeutic alliance, the quality of the relationship between therapist and patient, is so important. So you can't be forced to do psychotherapy, it just doesn't work. And successful psychotherapy creates a space by which the patient is guided into their own decisions. Another mechanism of the self that we can interrupt are these top-down processes. So remember that top-down processes involve guesses based on our expectations that can then allow us to quickly make sense of the world. And this could be dissolved with mindfulness meditation. Mindfulness is a buzzword in psychiatry now. It's been widely used. It's found to be quite effective in a number of different disorders. And it can be basically understood as paying attention to the unfolding of raw experiences in the present moment. And when one does this, one can notice these usual expectations and the reactions that follow, and so you can decouple from this. So if you consider someone waving their hand up in the air, your top-down processes and your expectations will change your automatic perception of it. So if you see someone doing this in the classroom, you'll automatically perceive this as one asking a question. If you see the same person doing it on a street, you'll see them as hailing a cab or waving at someone. But if someone has been severely abused, maybe as a child, they will, if someone does the same action at a dinner table, it might be perceived as the threat of being hit. And then there's concern and distress that follows. So same gesture, different perception and different outcome. And this is where mindful awareness could step in, because it can offer someone freedom from the rigid habits of oneself. Another thing we can learn from the self-illusion is that when we treat the self like a single core entity, we treat it like a linear system. So put simply, a linear system given a slight nudge will deviate slightly off course like a billiard ball, and if you give it a slightly stronger nudge, it'll deviate further off course. But the self is a non-linear system. There's many different working parts and they're interdependent. So it's a complex, chaotic system. Now you may have heard of chaos theory through the well-known term the butterfly effect. That can be basically understood as immeasurably small changes of a complex system at one point will lead to unpredictable changes at a later state. Right? So chaos theory has shown us that finer knowledge of a complex system doesn't necessarily give us better power to predict how it will behave at a later state. And this has been the end of the Newtonian dream. the thought that we could perfectly predict the future. So people are like weather patterns. We can make very basic probability predictions for a short time into the future, but further than that we cannot know. So the inability to predict the mental states and behaviours of our patients simply isn't a pragmatic issue of needing to gain more data about their lives, it's just a mathematical principle. So to give us a point of contact here, we don't know when someone's going to do the most consequential thing in their life, and that's kill themselves. So psychiatrists, unfortunately, are barely better than a coin flip at predicting suicide. But what this shows us is that we shouldn't feel bad about this, but there is something that we can do. Chaos theory has shown us that complex systems such as economies, ecosystems, and brains are the most stable and flexible when they're endowed with good interconnectivity and good integration. So in psychotherapy, this could be achieved through linkages of different aspects of the brain, different aspects of our mental lives. So as I mentioned before, the wiring of the brain is constantly changing through neuroplastic processes. So the wiring of our brain changes in response to experience. And one form of experience that we know that does this is simply attention. So paying attention to different aspects of our mental lives and the relationships between them, so emotions, beliefs, intentions, current behavioural states, we can form linkages between them, and this can lead to integration. So this might be one way how the general art of introspection in psychotherapy and mindfulness meditation might be making some of their contributions. And then if we take a wider conceptual view here, one could view integration as collaboration linkage across different motivational states and drives. So things like intellectual pursuit, reproduction, child rearing, playful exploration, etc. So linkage across these states is healthy. And the notion that we could have a single, rigid, consistent self is idealistic and unhealthy. The other thing is that we should note that psychotherapists themselves are an illusory self that's constantly being propped up by these biases and made up stories. So the narrative that I'm a good psychiatrist, I know my patients well, I make good decisions about them, will undoubtedly be employing these self-illusory mechanisms, and it can easily fool ourselves into thinking that we're doing the right thing for our patients, especially in the closed-loop environment of therapist and patient. Now, I'm not saying that psychiatrists are the only ones that are subject to this, many different professions, but it does teach us why anecdote and case studies can be unreliable, and it does underpin the ongoing need for good quality, rigorous empirical research. So we all have an illusory self. So it's this experience as coherent, constant beings in a world that we understand. What the self-illusion teaches us firstly is how much we can and indeed do change. And this firstly can be empowering for psychotherapy and for our patients as well. But secondly, when we look under the hood of the self at its inner workings, we find that it's just simply made up of a bag of tricks. Instead of being scared by these tricks, if we start to learn about these things and we can tinker them in our favour, we can help construct better selves for the lives of people. So I think that this way of thinking might provide us with a good avenue in the future to develop psychotherapy. Thanks.